Before we begin this story, if you enjoy deep, immersive dives into the hidden corners of history, please consider subscribing. Your support helps bring these forgotten events to life. Now, onto our story. Abercairn, Ayrshire, Scotland. November 13th, 1943, 2051. The music died not with a fade, but with the violent scratch of a needle dragged across vinyl. The laughter in the Abercairn village hall evaporated, sucked into the sudden cold vacuum. 200 faces, local farm hands, factory girls from the munitions plant, grizzled Home Guard volunteers, and a scattering of American GIs all turned toward the door. Rain and wind lashed the blackout curtains, but a new, colder draft swept the dance floor. Two men stood silhouetted in the entryway. Then they stepped into the warm, smoky light. Their uniforms were sharp, perfectly pressed, and utterly alien. The white MP on their helmets seemed to glow. Behind them stood four more, holding batons. At their head was a U.S. Army officer, Captain Miles Thorne, his face a mask of pale, rigid fury. Beside him, Lieutenant Doyle, the head of the military police detachment, surveyed the room with a look of profound distaste. "This event," Captain Thorne announced, his voice cutting through the stunned silence, "is an unauthorized fraternization." Alistair McDougall, the village elder and a veteran of the Somme, stepped forward, his Home Guard armband crooked on his tweed jacket. "Now see here, Captain, this is a village social. Your lads were invited." Thorne's eyes didn't even flicker toward the old Scot. They scanned the GIs, who were frozen in place, their partner's hands still on their shoulders. He was hunting. His gaze locked onto a corporal near the punch bowl, a fast-talking kid from Brooklyn with dark, curly hair, who was in the middle of a joke. Corporal Roth. Corporal Sammy. Sammy Roth's smile vanished. Thorne's eyes moved. Private Epstein. PFC David Epstein, quieter, standing near the fiddler, instinctively touched the small book of poetry in his breast pocket. "You two," Thorne snapped, pointing, "and any other Hebrews in this hall, you are in violation of a direct order. You will return to base now." The air turned to ice. The Scottish villagers looked at each other, not in fear, but in a state of profound, collective confusion. They knew what Hebrews meant, but the context was baffling. "Captain," Sammy Roth said, his voice shaky but trying for its usual bravado. "With respect, sir, we're on a valid 24-hour pass." "Your pass," Thorne spat, "does not entitle you to undermine unit cohesion or violate the articles of military conduct. Lieutenant, escort these men out." Lieutenant Doyle and his MPs took a step forward, batons raised. "No," a voice said. It wasn't a soldier. It was Fiona Donaldson, the postmistress's daughter, who was standing beside David Epstein. Doyle paused, genuinely surprised. "Ma'am, this is U.S. Army business." "Not in here, it's not," Alistair McDougall said, his voice a low growl. He and two other Home Guard members, both men in their 50s, moved to stand in front of the MPs. They were armed only with their age and their indignation. "This is our hall," Alistair said, his eyes fixed on Thorne. "And these lads," he gestured to Sammy and David, "are our guests. You'll not be taking them." The MPs gripped their batons. The farmers at the back of the hall began to quietly drift forward, their expressions hardening. The wind howled outside, but inside, a different, more dangerous storm was about to break. To understand the standoff in the Abercairn Hall, one must understand the year 1943. This was the period of the build-up, the ambitious and massive Operation Bolero. The British Isles were being transformed into a colossal armed camp, a staging ground for the inevitable, terrifying invasion of Fortress Europe. Into this ancient, war-weary, and rain-soaked land flooded over 1.5 million American soldiers. They were the Yanks, loud, confident, well-fed, and armed with chewing gum, chocolate, and a casual wealth that staggered the ration-bound British. They brought their tanks, their bombers, and their peerless industrial might. And they also brought their shadows. The United States Army that arrived in Great Britain was a force riven by an ironclad systemic prejudice. The most visible and infamous was the Jim Crow segregation of its black soldiers. They were confined to separate units, given menial labor, and subjected to a rigid social apartheid that the U.S. command expected its British hosts to enforce. But there was another quieter line of division, It was the pervasive, casual, and often institutional anti-Semitism that ran through the veins of the American officer corps, much of which was drawn from an establishment that still considered Hebrews to be a separate and lesser class. Jewish American soldiers, unlike their black counterparts, were not officially segregated. They were, in theory, just white soldiers. But in practice, they were often othered. They were the Roths, the Epsteins, the Cohens, names that officers like Captain Thorne would circle on rosters. They were clever, pushy, not team players. They were suspected of dual loyalty, or conversely, of cowardice. They were the first to be assigned unpleasant duties and the last to be considered for promotion. The central problem was this: the U.S. Army was attempting to export its complex, toxic social hierarchy to a country that simply didn't understand it. The villagers of Abercairn, a small Presbyterian community in Ayrshire, were not worldly. They had likely never met a Jewish person before 1943. But their worldview, forged by centuries of religious principle and a fierce sense of local independence, was binary. You were a neighbor, or you were not. You were fighting Hitler, or you were not. To them, the enemy was the man dropping bombs on Clydebank. The Allies were the men who came to stop him. The idea that an American officer would storm into their hall to arrest a fellow American, not for spying, not for theft, but for the crime of being Jewish at a dance, was more than offensive. It was insane. For Corporal Sammy Roth and PFC David Epstein, the months leading up to that November night had been a slow grinding education in despair. Their unit, part of a Signal Corps battalion, was stationed at a sprawling, muddy Nissen hut camp just outside Abercairn. Life was a routine of rain, drills, and the constant thrumming anxiety of the coming invasion. But the real war, for now, was fought inside the wire. U.S. Army Base, Ayrshire, September 14th, 1943, 11 hours. Roth, Epstein! Sergeant Bellows, their platoon sergeant, yelled across the parade ground. You're on latrine duty, again. Sammy looked up from cleaning his rifle. But Sarge, we just pulled latrine duty. It's C platoon's turn. Bellows, a decent man from Ohio, wouldn't meet his eye. Orders from the CO. Captain Thorne wants the camp's appearance improved. You two are his special projects. Just get it done. It was always them. They were barracks lawyers, if they questioned an order, shirkers, if they didn't volunteer. The true failure was the failure of their own system to protect them. The NCO Club, with its warm fire and cheap beer, was technically open to all non-commissioned officers. But when Sammy, a corporal, had walked in one rainy Tuesday, the chatter stopped. A lieutenant from another company looked up from his poker game. Can we help you, Corporal? Just getting a beer, sir, Sammy had said. This is a private game, Roth, and frankly the club's a bit full tonight. Maybe try the enlisted mess. The message was clear. The no dogs, no Irish signs of a previous generation had simply been updated with an unspoken no Jews. David Epstein felt it differently. He was quiet, seeking refuge in the books his mother sent him, but he saw it in the mail calls. Epstein got a package from Mama Epstein, the mail clerk would shout, drawing out the name. Hope it's not more of that smelly fish you guys eat. Laughter, always the laughter. The desperation was not physical. They were fed, clothed, and trained. It was a spiritual erosion. They were here to fight a German madman who wanted to exterminate them for their blood, only to find the same poison, diluted but still potent, in the coffee they drank every morning. Captain Thorne was the source. He was a man who believed in order. To him, Jews, like the colored troops, were a disruption to that order. Thorne's office, October 2nd, 1943, 09:15. Corporal Roth, Thorne had said, looking at a file on his desk, not at Sammy. Your accent, it's unprofessional. You're from New York, I see. Brooklyn, sir. Yes. Well, here, you're a soldier in the United States Army. We speak the King's English, or at least American English. Not that. It sets a poor example. It suggests a lack of discipline. Do you understand me? Sir, Yes, sir. Dismissed. They were trapped in their own uniforms, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by an enemy in front and a corrosive contempt from within. They had no recourse, no one to appeal to. They had failed repeatedly to be seen as just American. The invention that would change their lives was not a piece of technology. It was not a tank, a plane, or a weapon. It was an idea, and it wasn't sparked by one mind, but by the collision of two worlds in a smoky pub. The Black Stag Pub, Abercairn, October 22, 1943, 19. Sammy and David had walked the 2 miles to Abercairn simply to escape the Nissen hut. The rain had plastered their hair to their heads. They were miserable. They pushed open the door to the local pub, the Black Stag, expecting the same cold reception as the NCO club. The pub was a fug of peat smoke, wet wool, and stale ale. A dozen men in flat caps and thick jumpers looked up, appraised them, and returned to their conversations. The man behind the bar was a mountain, with a face like a worn granite cliff. This was Alistair McDougall. 2 beers, please, David said quietly, laying a shilling on the wet bar. Alistair pulled 2 pints of heavy, dark ale. Yanks, eh? From the camp. That's right, Sammy said, wary. Got a problem with that? Alistair let out a dry chuckle. Son, I've had the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in here on a Saturday night. I reckon I can handle 2 wet lads from the Signal Corps. Where you from? New York, Sammy said. Ohio, said David. Right. Well, I'm from here. And I was in Ypres when your lot were still learning to shave. Drink up. They stood by the bar, nursing the strange, warm beer. A young woman, Fiona Donaldson, approached them from a table where she was knitting. You're a long way from home, she said, her voice soft. You're telling me, Sammy replied, offering his first real smile in weeks. Sammy Roth. David Epstein. Fiona Donaldson. She looked at David. What's that in your pocket? It's not standard issue. David blushed and pulled out his worn copy of Keats. Just poetry. Fiona's eyes lit up. Keats? Goodness, I thought all you Yanks read was, well, not Keats. The spark happened then. It was the simple, profound shock of being treated as individuals. Not as Yanks, not as soldiers, and crucially, not as Hebrews. David was the lad who reads Keats. Sammy was the cheeky one from New York. They stayed for 2 hours. They talked about the rain, about rationing, about New York. Alistair, discovering they were radio men, spent 20 minutes complaining about the BBC's reception. When they left, Alistair grunted, "Don't be strangers, and tell your pals. Long as they're paying, they're welcome." This was the unlikely mind. It was the mind of a Scottish village, personified by Alistair and Fiona. It was a mind that had an invention it didn't even know was special. A stubborn, principled, and absolute sense of fairness. They saw men in uniform, allies in a desperate war, and their instinct was to offer a chair and a pint, not to check their credentials or their bloodline. For Sammy and David, walking back in the rain, the mud seemed less deep, the air less cold. They had found a foxhole. The foxhole grew. Sammy and David returned, bringing a few others from their platoon, including their non-Jewish Sergeant Bellows, who found Alistair's commentary on the war a hell of a lot more sensible than the CO's. The village, starved for new faces and grateful for the Allies, adopted them. Invitations to Sunday tea followed. Soldiers, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, found themselves sitting in cramped, cold parlors, being offered precious, hoarded scones and weak tea by women who reminded them of their mothers. This was the first step, the quiet, human-to-human integration. But this invention of simple decency immediately met the skepticism of the military machine. The Black Stag Pub, November 2nd, 1943, 14. Captain Thorne's jeep crunched to a halt outside the pub. It was a cold, bright afternoon. He entered the pub, his polished boots clicking on the stone floor. Alistair was wiping glasses. The pub was empty save for the Reverend MacLeod, the village minister, nursing a cup of tea by the fire. "Mr. McDougall," Thorne said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Captain," Alistair replied, not stopping his work. "It has come to my attention that you are encouraging fraternization with soldiers from my command." "I'm serving paying customers, Captain. That's all." Thorne's face tightened. "Let's be clear. I have a responsibility to the morale and discipline of my men. That includes all my men. I understand you are partial to certain types of soldiers. The rag in Alistair's hand stopped. Types? Men like Roth and Epstein. You are encouraging them, giving them a special status? This is unhelpful. The Reverend MacLeod cleared his throat and stood up. He was a small, bird-like man, but his eyes were sharp. Captain Thorne, I am the Reverend MacLeod. Perhaps I can assist. What Mr. McDougall is encouraging is fellowship, a core tenet of our faith, and I had assumed yours. Thorne was visibly irritated. He was used to giving orders, not debating theology. Reverend, this is a military matter. We are fighting a war. Unit cohesion is paramount. When men of a certain background are seen to be getting special treatment from the locals, it causes resentment. It breaks down the chain of command. This was the bureaucratic argument. The clash between tradition, the Army's prejudice, and innovation, Alistair's fairness. Special treatment, Alistair said, finally turning to face Thorne. I treat them the same as I treat everyone. They buy a drink, they drink it in peace. That's the rule, the only rule. That, Thorne said, his voice dropping, is not my rule. I am suggesting, as a representative of the Allied Command, that you defer to our judgment on how to handle our own men. It would be unfortunate if this village were to be found inhospitable to U.S. troops. It was a threat, clear and cold. He was threatening to declare the entire village off limits, cutting off the GIs and the small revenue they brought. My judgment, Captain, Alistair said, placing his hands on the bar, is that a man's a man. My pub, my rules. He's welcome here. Thorne stared at him for a long, cold moment. I see. You are making a grave mistake. He turned and left. The Reverend MacLeod looked at Alistair. You've poked the bear, Alistair. Aye, Alistair said, picking up his rag. And I'll poke him again. Go tell Fiona. We'll move the Saturday social to the village hall, and tell her to invite all the Yanks, every last one. The prototype was not built of steel or wood. It was built of defiance, whispered conversations, and scones. It was the village of Abercairn formally deciding to build a shield. After Thorne's visit, Alistair, Fiona, and the Reverend MacLeod held a quiet, informal meeting with the town council. The skepticism was palpable, but it wasn't aimed at the soldiers. It was aimed at the U.S. Army Command. He'll declare us off limits, Alistair, said the butcher. We'll lose the trade. What trade? Fiona shot back. A few shillings on beer? This isn't about trade. It's about, well, it's about what's right. We're fighting a war against that. She pointed in the vague direction of Europe. We can't let it in our own hall. The Reverend MacLeod sealed it. The captain's prejudice is a sickness. We are being asked to host that sickness. I say we refuse. The prototype then was this: the Abercairn Village Dance. It was a public, formal, and organized act of defiance. Fiona and her committee mimeographed invitations and sent them officially to the U.S. Base addressed to Sergeant Bellow's platoon and friends. The materials were simple: a fiddler, a record player, tables laden with tea and biscuits, and the entire village. The improvisation came from the GIs themselves. Sammy and David were terrified. Nissen Hut 4, November 10th, 1943, 22 on. We can't go, Sam, David said, his face pale in the light of a single bulb. He'll crucify us. You heard what he said to you. First wave. He'll do it. So what? Sammy retorted, polishing his boots with more force than necessary. We hide? We sit in this dump while the whole village stands up for us? What does that make us? Alive, David said. That's not living, Dave. That's just waiting. I'm sick of waiting, and I'm sick of being ashamed. They're not ashamed of us. Why should we be? Sergeant Bellows came in, ducking under the low doorway. Heard about the dance. Captain Thorne has strongly advised that no personnel attend. He's posting MPs at the gate to take names. Sammy's face fell. The prototype had failed before it was even assembled. But, Bellows said, a small, rare smile playing on his lips, he's only posting them at the main gate, the fence behind the motor pool. It's got a loose section, has for weeks. A man could slip through there at 19:30 and be back by 23, and no one would be the wiser. Sarge? Sammy said, stunned. I'm not telling you to go. I'm just stating a fact about base security, Bellows said. He tossed a pack of Lucky Strikes onto Sammy's bunk. Have a good time, lads. I'll be in the orderly room playing cards. Loudly, in case anyone asks. The prototype was complete. The village had provided the venue. Their own sergeant had provided the way. The only thing left was to see if it would work. The first test of this communal invention was never meant to be the dance. It happened, as it so often does, by accident, in the same place the alliance was forged. The Black Stag Pub, November 12, 1943, 21. It was the night before the dance. Sammy and David, their nerves on fire, had slipped out to the Black Stag to test the waters. They needed to see Alistair, to warn him that Thorne was on the warpath. The pub was quiet. Alistair was there, as was Fiona, and half a dozen locals. He's posting guards, Alistair, Sammy said, sipping a beer he didn't want. He's trying to stop us. Aye, well, he can try, Alistair said. The hall is booked. The scones are baked. We'll be there. If you're not, we'll understand. We'll be there, David said, surprising himself with his own firmness. The door swung open. The chill of the night air returned. It was Lieutenant Doyle, the MP boss, and two of his men. They weren't wearing their formal MP helmets, just their liners. They were on patrol. Doyle saw Sammy and David. His face, which was permanently set in a sneer, deepened. He had been present at Thorne's office and knew these were the problem soldiers. Well, Doyle said, walking to the bar. Look what we have here. Roth, Epstein. You're a little far from home, aren't you? On pass, Lieutenant, Sammy said, his hand tightening on his glass. Passes can be revoked, Doyle said. He turned to Alistair. Barkeep, I'm surprised at you. Serving these types. This was the test. It was controlled, but the stakes were high. It was just the GIs, the villagers, and the MPs. No Captain Thorne, just the raw, ugly reality. Alistair slowly, deliberately put down the glass he was drying. His money is good, same as yours. What'll you have? Doyle laughed, a short, sharp bark. I'm not here to drink. I'm here to inspect. I'm not sure this establishment meets the hygiene standards for U.S. personnel. He ran a white-gloved finger along the bar and held it up. It was, of course, dusty. See? Filthy. Get out, Alistair said. It was not a request. Doyle's hand dropped to the wooden baton on his belt. His two MPs fanned out, their expressions hardening. You're telling an officer of the U.S. Army to leave? In wartime? That's unallied of you. I'm telling a bully to leave my pub, Alistair said. And then the invention activated. A farmer named Tam, who had been sitting by the fire, stood up. He was 60 years old and held a gnarled shepherd's crook. He stood next to Alistair. Another man, the town's blacksmith, put down his darts and stood by the door, blocking the MP's exit. Fiona, her face white, stepped up to the bar next to David and Sammy. Doyle looked around. He was armed. His men were armed. These were just old men and a woman. But they were not moving, and he was on their territory. He was in a civilian establishment in a foreign country, threatening non-combatants. The legal ground was tissue paper. This, Doyle said, pointing a finger at Sammy, is on you. You're done. Both of you. He motioned to his men. We're leaving. They backed out of the door, their bravado gone. The pub was silent for a full 10 seconds after they left. Then Alistair picked up his rag and went back to wiping the glass. Right, he said, as if nothing had happened. So, the dance is tomorrow then. Fiona, did you remember to order the lemonade? The test was a success. The Alliance had held under direct physical intimidation. But they all knew, as they drank their beer, that this was just the prelude. The real trial was yet to come. Abercairn Village Hall, November 13th, 1943, 2052. The scene from the opening chapter was now in full, terrible motion. Captain Thorne, having been thwarted in his requests, and enraged by Doyle's failure at the pub, had decided on a show of force. This was not a negotiation, it was a military operation. Alistair, Thorne said, his voice dangerously calm as the old Scot blocked his path. I will say this one time. Stand aside. No, Alistair said. Lieutenant Doyle, Thorne ordered. Remove these civilians, use necessary force, and apprehend Roth and Epstein. Aye, try it, snarled Tam, the farmer, hefting his crook. Doyle and his 5 MPs moved forward. They were trained. They were young, fit, and angry. They expected the old men to fold. They did not. The first MP shoved Alistair. Alistair, a veteran of trench raids, didn't shove back. He punched the MP square in the nose with a crack that echoed through the hall, and the Battle of Abercairn began. It was not a cinematic, sweeping fight. It was a chaotic, ugly, desperate brawl. It was a mass of tweed jackets and home guard uniforms crashing against olive drab. The farmers and blacksmiths, men used to heavy physical labor, grabbed MPs in headlocks. An MP swung his baton and struck the fiddler's instrument, splintering it. The women, screaming, began throwing whatever they could: teacups, chairs, the lemonade pitcher. Sammy and David were frozen for a split second. This was for them. These people were getting hurt for them. "No!" David yelled, and he did something he had never done in his life. He tackled the nearest MP, catching him around the knees, driving him into a table of sandwiches. Sammy, seeing David in the fray, went feral. He grabbed the MP Alistair had punched and threw him toward the door. "Get out of here! Leave them alone!" It was chaos. The air was full of shouts, American curses, and thick Scottish oaths. Captain Thorne, his perfect uniform now splattered with tea and, was that blood, looked on in horror. His authority had not just been questioned, it had been physically dismantled by a village of farmers. "Get out!" he screamed at his men. "Doyle! Form up! We are leaving!" Doyle, his lips split, grabbed his 2 most disoriented men and bodily dragged them backward out the door. The remaining MPs scrambled after them, their batons lost, their pride shattered. The engines of their jeeps roared to life and they sped off into the rainy night, leaving a trail of humiliation. The village hall was a wreck. The music was gone. The floor was a mess of broken glass and spilled food. Tam had a black eye. Alistair was breathing heavily, clutching his ribs. Fiona was helping the fiddler, who was staring at his broken instrument. David Epstein stood in the middle of the room, shaking. Sammy Roth was leaning against a wall, his knuckles bloody. The villagers looked at them, and then Alistair McDougall, wincing, walked over to the record player. He picked up the needle, found the groove on the record, and the swing music, scratchy and tinny, filled the hall again. "Right," Alistair announced to the room. "Let's tidy this up. The night's not over." Fiona Donaldson walked over to David, whose glasses were askew. She straightened them. Then she took his hand. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's dance." This was the victory. It wasn't just that they had repelled the MPs. It was that they had done so. And then they had continued the dance. The invention, communal defiance, had been tested in combat and had proven stronger than the U.S. Army's official policy. The Battle of Abercairn, as it was immediately and quietly dubbed, sent a seismic shockwave through the U.S. Army Command in Scotland. Captain Thorne returned to base apoplectic, his report bordering on treason. "The local population," he wrote, "aided by communist sympathizing elements, staged an insurrection. They violently assaulted military police. This command recommends the entire village of Abercairn be placed under permanent quarantine." But Thorne had made a critical error. The battle had not gone unnoticed. The local Scottish constabulary, summoned by a neighbor who heard the commotion, filed their own report. This report went to the Chief Constable of Ayrshire, who, being a personal friend of Alistair McDougall, promptly forwarded it to the Scottish Secretary's office in Edinburgh. Within 48 hours, a "Please Explain" cable landed on the desk of the U.S. Army's regional commander, a pragmatic, battle-weary brigadier general named Harris. General Harris's office, Prestwick, November 15, 1943, 10. General Harris stared at the report, then at Captain Thorne, who was standing at rigid attention. "You brawled," Harris said, his voice quiet, "with a village of old men." "Sir, they assaulted my MPs. They were harboring problematic soldiers." "They were what?" Harris snapped. "Harboring? Are we in occupied France, Captain? Or are we in the country of our closest ally? You took 5 armed men into a civilian dance to arrest 2 of your own soldiers. For what? What was their crime? Espionage? Murder? Thorne stammered. Sir, it was a matter of discipline, of social order. Social order, Harris repeated, his disgust plain. He picked up the cable from Edinburgh. The Scottish Secretary wants to know why my MPs are behaving like, well, I can't repeat the word he used. He wants to know why we are enforcing social policies that his government finds repugnant. Do you have an answer for that, Captain? Sir, I was following standing procedure. Your procedure has just jeopardized our lease on this airfield, Harris said. It has jeopardized our supply lines, which rely entirely on local Scottish labor. You have, in one night of profound stupidity, done more damage to Allied relations than a German U-boat. The recognition was immediate and decisive. The invention had won. The U.S. Army, obsessed with its own internal prejudices, had slammed headfirst into an immovable object, a small town's sense of decency, amplified by international diplomacy. You are relieved of your post, Captain, Harris said. You will be transferred to a depot in Iceland. Perhaps the social order there will be more to your liking. He dismissed Thorne and summoned Sergeant Bellows. Bellows entered, terrified. Sergeant, Harris said, I have read Captain Thorne's report. He has recommended Corporal Roth and Private Epstein for court-martial. Bellows's blood ran cold. I, Harris continued, tearing the report in half, am rejecting that recommendation. I am, however, noting that 2 of your men were involved in a civilian disturbance. That's bad for morale. Sir, so I am officially ordering you to encourage your platoon to accept all local invitations for fellowship. I want those villagers to know we are their friends. I want this smoothed over, and I want it done yesterday. Is that clear? Yes, General, Bellows said, a massive grin suppressed. The domino effect was immediate. The news of a captain being banished for his prejudice spread through the ranks like wildfire. Jewish GIs and other units heard the story, and it gave them a new, quiet confidence. And the village of Abercairn, far from being blacklisted, became an unofficial R&R destination for the entire battalion. The invention, communal solidarity, was a success. But like any new technology, it immediately underwent field modifications as the enemy, prejudice, adapted. The enemy was no longer the overt malice of Captain Thorne. It was the subtle, bureaucratic resistance of the system he had represented. The new CO, a major, was under strict orders from General Harris to keep the peace. But Lieutenant Doyle, the MP, remained. He couldn't touch the GIs in the village, but he could, and did, make their lives miserable on base. Field modification. Enemy. Harassment by regulation. Doyle's MPs would stop Sammy and David for the slightest infraction. A button unfastened. A salute held for a fraction of a second too short. A speck of mud on a boot. You think you're special, Roth, Doyle would mutter, writing out a demerit. You think your Scotch friends can save you. They're not here now, are they? Field modification. Friendly. Internal solidarity. The Abercairn incident had changed the dynamic within the platoon. The non-Jewish GIs, who had once been indifferent or vaguely complicit, now saw Sammy and David differently. They had seen them fight. They had seen a village fight for them. When Doyle put Sammy on a 24-hour guard rotation, 2 other GIs from his hut, accidentally, switched the roster, splitting the duty between them. Shut up, Roth, one of them, a tough kid from Chicago, said when Sammy tried to thank him. Doyle's a rat. We don't like rats. Field modification. Friendly. The adoption program. The village of Abercairn, emboldened by their victory, modified their invention. It was no longer just about dances and pubs. They adopted the platoon. Knowing the GIs were on base, Fiona and the other women began organizing care packages, not for the GIs, but from them. They would bake using their own rations and deliver the packages to the base from your local friends. The new CO, eager to please General Harris, had to accept them. The packages, filled with fresh-baked bread, shortbread, and jam, were distributed. But Alistair and Fiona made sure that Hut 4, Sammy's hut, got the lion's share. It was a clear public signal. These are our boys. We are still watching. The enemy countermeasure was to try and separate them. Orders came down for a personnel review. Sammy, A skilled radio operator was suddenly slated for transfer to a frontline infantry unit as a basic rifleman. David, with his clerical skills, was to be moved to a Graves registration unit. This was Doyle's final move. He was scattering the problem. But the field modification came from Sergeant Bellows. He lost the transfer order. He lost it for 3 solid weeks, burying it under a stack of requisitions for bootlaces and antifreeze. "Paperwork's a nightmare, Lieutenant," Bellows would say with a perfectly straight face. "I'll get right on it, as soon as I find it." He delayed just long enough. The first week of December, new sweeping orders came down from high command. The entire Signal Battalion was being moved south. The invasion was getting close. Doyle's petty war was overruled by a real one. Success is never clean. The victory at Abercairn, while profound, came with a heavy, unspoken cost. The first cost was the guilt. David Epstein, the quiet one, felt it most acutely. He saw Alistair McDougall 2 days after the brawl. The old man's ribs were taped, and he breathed with a shallow wheeze. This is our fault, Alistair," David said, his voice thick with shame. "We should never have come." Alistair grabbed David's tunic and pulled him close, his eyes blazing. Don't you dare cheapen what we did. We didn't fight for you, lad. Not really. We fought for this." He stamped his foot on the pub's stone floor. "For our rules. You were just the reason. Don't you dare take that from us. You stand up straight. You're a soldier. Act like one." David stood up straight, but the weight remained. The second cost was the fear. Captain Thorne was gone, but his threat remained. "You'll be first off the boat." Sammy Roth, for all his Brooklyn bravado, was now a marked man. He knew that when they finally hit the beaches of France, there would be no Scottish villagers to protect him. The system he had defied would have its revenge. He had nightmares, not of Germans, but of Lieutenant Doyle, standing on a beach, pointing at him. You, Roth, front of the line. This fear created a moral dilemma. By standing up, had he just signed his own death warrant? And worse, David's? He had dragged his best friend into this. "Maybe we should have just taken it, Dave," Sammy whispered one night in the hut. "Just kept our heads down. We'd be safe." "We'd be what Thorne wanted us to be," David whispered back. "We'd be what they think we are. Cowards, hiding." Alistair was right. It's not about being safe. It's about being. The final consequence was the most ironic. Their victory had made them better soldiers, but for the wrong reasons. They now drilled with a grim, desperate intensity. They cleaned their rifles with religious fervor. They studied radio schematics until their eyes burned. They had to be perfect. They had to be twice as good as everyone else. They knew that the first time they made a mistake, the first time they hesitated, the system would say, "See, we told you." That's their kind. Their defiance had bought them allies, but it had stripped them of the right to be average, the right to be scared, the right to be anything less than flawless. The burden of representing their invention was, in its own way, as heavy as the prejudice it had defeated. Southampton Docks, England, May 28, 1944. The world had shrunk to the chaotic, diesel-choked confines of a staging area. The Abercairn campaign was a lifetime ago. Sammy and David's unit was crowded onto a hard-packed field, surrounded by thousands of other men, all anonymous in their helmets and combat gear. The campaign in Scotland was over. The war was about to begin. The legacy of Abercairn was not a medal. It was not a promotion. The legacy was in Sammy's breast pocket. It was a silver hip flask, engraved with the insignia of the Black Stag. Alistair had pressed it into his hand on their last day. "For the cold," he'd said. The legacy was in David's map case. It was a single pressed Scottish thistle, given to him by Fiona. "So you remember the way back," she'd said. The legacy was also in their orders. Sergeant Bellows had, at the last minute, found a new order. Sammy Roth, with his exemplary radio skills, was not going to be a rifleman. He was assigned to the beach command post as a primary operator. David Epstein, with his meticulous nature, was assigned to Bellows's own HQ unit as a runner and clerk. Bellows had used the field modification of his own NCO power to protect his men, an act he never would have considered 6 months prior. The immediate strategic impact was invisible to the generals, but monumental to the men. The Jewish soldiers of this battalion went to war not just as Americans, but as men who had proof of what they were fighting for. They weren't just fighting against Hitler. They were fighting for Alistair McDougall's pub, for Fiona's stubborn decency, for a village hall where a man could dance, regardless of his name. When the ramp on their landing craft dropped on June 6, 1944, they were fighting for Abercairn. The official legacy was buried in a U.S. Army file. General Harris's after-action report on community relations, UK, became a minor but influential document. It argued in dry, bureaucratic language that enforcement of stateside social norms in Allied territory was counterproductive to mission success. It recommended integrationist policies for off-base activities. It was the first tiny crack in the U.S. Army's iron wall of prejudice. An invention, built by a Scottish village, had become official U.S. Army doctrine, even if they never knew its name. Abercairn, Scotland, May 8, 1995. The village was much the same. The stone was darker, cleaned by 50 years of rain. The Nissen hut camp was long gone, reclaimed by green fields. An old man, walking with a pronounced limp, got out of a black cab. He leaned on his cane and looked up at the sign. The Black Stag. Sammy Roth, his hair white and thin, pushed open the door. The pub was brighter. The peat smoke was gone, banned, but the bar was the same. A young woman with Fiona's eyes was behind it. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her accent the same lilt he'd heard in his dreams. "A beer," Sammy said, his Brooklyn accent now softened by age. "Whatever's dark." He sat in the corner, by the fireplace. On the wall was a framed, yellowed photograph of a dance. It was the village hall, 1943. He saw Fiona. He saw Alistair. He saw a young, dark-haired soldier he barely recognized, himself. And beside him, smiling, glasses slightly askew, was David Epstein. "You were one of them, weren't you?" the young woman said, setting the beer down. "One of the Yanks." "I was," Sammy said, his voice thick. I knew your grandmother, Fiona." "She talked about you," the woman said, smiling. "She said you were the cheeky one." "And David?" Sammy asked, the word he had carried for 50 years. "Did she talk about Private Epstein?" "Aye," the woman said, her smile fading. "The poet. He didn't come back, did he?" "No," Sammy said. "He didn't. Omaha, June 6th. He was running a message to my post." They sat in silence. Sammy pulled the silver hip flask from his coat pocket. It was dented and scarred. He placed it on the bar. "My grandfather gave you that," the woman said, her voice full of wonder. "He did." Sammy raised his glass. "To Abercairn." "To Abercairn," she repeated. Voiceover, documentary style. Historian. History rightly focuses on the great battles and the band of brothers, the men who fought and died together. But we often forget these other smaller alliances. The Battle of Abercairn never made the papers. It was a brawl in a dance hall. But in its own way, it was as important as any skirmish. It was a test. The United States Army in 1943 was an institution that carried the virus of prejudice. And this small Scottish village, they were the antidote. They refused to be infected. These incidents, which happened in small pockets all over Britain, were a profound moral education for the GIs. Men like Sammy Roth and David Epstein were fighting for an ideal abroad that they were still being denied at home. When the war ended, these soldiers returned, changed. They had seen a different way. They had seen white allies risk their own safety, not for Hebrews or types, but for friends. That seed, planted in a rainy Scottish village, would, in time, grow into the long, hard fight for desegregation and civil rights back home. The war against Hitler was won in 1945, but the war that began in the Abercairn Hall, that fight continued for decades. Final scene. Sammy Roth stands in the small village kirkyard by the war memorial. It lists the local men who fell. And at the bottom, added on a small bronze plaque, and in memory of our Allied friends who fell in the Great Liberation, PFC David L. Epstein, U.S. Army. 6 June 1944. He walked in beauty, Sammy touches the cold bronze. He opens his copy of Keats, David's copy, which he'd carried off the beach, and places a single pressed thistle on the stone. He turns and limps back toward the pub.